And I'll now invite our panellists up. We have, of course, Caroline Spencer, the Auditor General, who I'm sure would be very well known to you, sitting next to Dr Gallop. We have Ian Cowie, Chief Executive Officer of the City of Gosnells, and Joanne Kummrow, who is the Public Access Deputy Commissioner Public Access Deputy Commissioner from the Office of the Victorian Information Commissioner. And at this point, I might just say that that there was a change to the panel. We're very lucky to have Joanne with us, who has replaced Michelle Andrews, the Director General of the Department of Communities, and I'm sure many of you will understand with the events of last week that she's got significant demands on her time, and she sends her apologies and was very sorry she couldn't participate because she would love to have been here. Just the introduction, Caroline Spencer was appointed the Auditor General in May of 2018 and is the first woman to undertake the role of Auditor General in Western Australia, so we're thrilled about that as well. Caroline has experience in financial and performance audit across jurisdictions and sectors, and prior to her appointment led a professional services firm specialising in public sector audit and governance, and she's held a number of board and audit committee roles in several jurisdictions. Caroline will talk to you a little bit, and each of the panellists will talk to you a little bit about what it is that they do, so I won't go into that too much. Her bio is available to you in our program. Ian Cowie is the CEO, as I said, of the City of Gosnells. Before this, Ian was the Director of Governance and Strategy at the City of Joondalup, where he was responsible for key city strategic and governance initiatives. Prior to joining local government in 2006, Ian worked as a state public servant for 18 years in a variety of positions in regional development, housing and local government. Part of that work included developing policy positions for and then implementing the Local Government Act of 1995, and hopefully we'll have some discussion around some reforms that have been proposed to the Local Government Act in the area of information disclosure as well, with Ian being on our panel. And then finally, Joanne. Joanne, very grateful to her, as I said, being here. Joanne had planned on coming to our conference, so we snapped her up to join our panel as well. Joanne was appointed appointed under the Freedom of Information Act in Victoria, as I said, the Public Access Deputy Commissioner, in May of this year, following her appointment in an acting capacity in May of 2018. As the Public Access Deputy Commissioner, Joanne works with the Victorian Information Commissioner and has statutory functions and powers under the FOI Act. So, like myself, is a decision maker under the FOI Act. Prior to coming to her role at OVIC, Joanne has more than 12 years' experience as a senior legal practitioner at the Victorian Government Solicitor's Office, where she has a broad administrative law practice, or had a broad administrative law practice, and managed administrative and regulatory law teams. So Joanne brings significant experience to our panel today and a significant perspective on FOI matters.
Up the back there. Thank you. Well, thanks very much. It's an absolute pleasure to be here in Perth and to be participating in this conference. As Catherine said, a big part of my role is making decisions, so I'm often tucked away in an office. We have a very strong culture of FOI in Victoria. Sometimes I think it's a bit too strong, in the sense that we had last year 38,500 FOI requests made to agencies, and we just came in under the Commonwealth for all of their agencies around Australia. So you can sort of see it's a very strong culture of FOI. But I endorse Geoff's comments in relation to pro-disclosure. One of the things that we're working on, and it's a slow and steady process, is to really work with the public sector in Victoria to strengthen the positive culture of proactive and informal disclosure where it's appropriate to do so. We in Victoria have a 1982 Act, and so in general parlance it's called a first generation FOI legislation. We don't have Queensland's progressive FOI legislation, which is also kind of shared too in New South Wales as well, I understand. But so we have sort of like what we call a version 1.5. So we have had some amendments in 2017. OVIC was created. Sven, the former Information Commissioner from WA, who I understand is very fondly regarded, sends his regards. We're pleased to have him back in Victoria. but created the office. Sven took up his position. I have a deputy public access, it's called, not FOI. The government's called it public access deputy commissioner. And I have another deputy commissioner colleague, Rachel Dixon, and so she handles privacy and data protection. So we're the first jurisdiction to have those three disciplines under the one roof. So that's freedom of information, privacy, and data security, or information security. And privacy and data security, I think you'll all understand, are really, sort of going through the roof at the moment. In terms of Cambridge Analytica and Facebook and AI and decision making and ethics in relation to AI and privacy and data. So that keeps us fairly busy. So we handle at OVIC reviews. We don't have an internal review. Agencies make their decision, and then if an applicant is not satisfied with that decision, they can make a review application to OVIC. We also deal with complaints, and that's a really big part of our work as well. And that's complaints in relation to agency handling, or where documents can't be located or don't exist. So actions taken or failed to be taken. We've recently just introduced some professional standards as well, which will apply, and they bind principal officers within agencies. So that's the principal officer of the Department of Premier and Cabinet is the secretary. So they go right up to the top there, and also FOI practitioners. So it's a changing landscape in Victoria, but that's a little bit of an insight into the work that we do.
Thank you. Thank you, Joanne. I'll ask Ian to give some introductory remarks.
Thank you for the opportunity to be here, Catherine.
Thank you.
I want to focus my comments today on risk, and I see risk as being something that's been growing over the past decades as an issue, particularly in local government. And from an information perspective, when I speak with people about risk, it seems to me that the focus is always on the risk of releasing information inappropriately, the risk of releasing information which exposes us that we've made a mistake or we've exposed a weakness. And look, while I think risk is important, and I need to say that with the Auditor General next to me, I do worry that if we focus too much on risk, the way that we're going to start viewing the world is that everything becomes a risk if we take action. It becomes a risk to release information, because we might release inappropriate information. It might expose the organisation to public scrutiny when we might not like that. For me, I take completely the opposite view. I see any request for information as an opportunity, and it's an opportunity for my organisation to demonstrate that we are operating in the best interests of our community. But let me say, as a very large local government with 650, 700 staff approximately, we will make mistakes, and we will inevitably make mistakes on a fairly regular basis. But we can't be worried about that. From my perspective, applications for information provide us, if we've done something wrong, with the opportunity to apologise and hopefully to be able to correct something if we've actually done it wrong. If I think about risk and information, I think the real great risk is that if we don't release information, we are seen as generating community suspicion. What's going on in this government entity? We become seen as a black hole. And we also risk losing public trust and public confidence. And let me say to you that as a public servant for all of my life, I think the greatest risk we face as public servants is the loss of the public trust in what we do. And I think you are absolutely critical in trying to make sure that we do maintain that public trust. So consequently, I want to start from a perspective of the starting point is that all our information is available, and we work back from there. And I suppose then the next question is, what do I do as a CEO to try and deliver on this type of vision? And I suppose my view is that I need to create a culture in the organisation which is safe and secure, where officers feel empowered to take actions in the best interests of the local government, and that they're comfortable releasing and sharing information, and that this ensures that we are a transparent organisation, which we need to be, and we can be held to account if we've done something wrong.
That's fabulous, Ian. Thank you. Great leadership, obviously, in local government from Ian. Thank you, Caroline. Some introductory remarks, if you will.
Well, thank you, Commissioner, and it really is a great pleasure to be here, and I am so delighted to see so many people here interested in this very important topic, representing so many public sector entities here in WA. So what a great opportunity to share knowledge and to promote concepts that will benefit our communities. And Ian, as a leader, not just of one of the entities in local government that we audit, but as a leader across the sector through your role as President of LG Professionals, it is wonderful to hear such tangible commitment to transparency and accountability, and it's always a pleasure to deal with Ian and his entity, but also the work that he's doing across the sector. For me, transparency and accountability are obviously key pillars of open and accountable government, but they're also an ongoing source of tension and a challenge for public sector entities and auditors general across Westminster systems. My work as Auditor General and as an independent officer of the Parliament of Western Australia, really, the eyes and ears of the Parliament, or the watchdog as we're often called, focuses mostly on the principle of promoting government accountability. And that principle was foremost in Captain Stirling's mind when he created the Board of Counsel and Audit for the colony, even before stepping off the boat to establish the colony. And I must personally acknowledge the Noongar people as the traditional custodians of the land on which we're meeting, and I recognise that the 190th anniversary of my office is also a very significant event for the first people of this place. And as we celebrate in the Parliament next month our 190th anniversary, I'm looking forward to hearing from Dr. Richard Wally, a Noongar elder who has started the conversation with my office around Aboriginal governance, because I recognise, and the issues here that Dr. Gallop has talked about, we have a very good system of governance. It is precious, it's fragile, it's not perfect, we don't have all the answers. So what can we learn from the most ancient of cultures that have been governing across vast distances and complex issues over thousands of years? You may be aware that the work of my office in promoting accountability focuses or really does three main things. We audit the financial statements of every entity, every state sector entity, 180 odd of them, and now local government entities, 148 of them. So we do the financial audits and promote accountability, transparency and accurate reporting in financial statements. We also conduct performance audits, so recently we released Working with Children checks, review of that regulatory function, access to state-managed mental health services, fraud control and prevention in local government. And you may be aware that with the Information Commissioner, we are ex officio State Records Commissioners, which is a role that we both hold with great pleasure and delight, given our commitment to accountability and our knowledge and awareness of the importance of good records for promoting not just accountability but good decision making and ultimately good government. So something that I think may be of interest to some of you here, as I expect that you may be, some of the officers that deal with it, is the other area of my statutory functions, which is dealing under Section 82 of the Financial Management Act. When a minister determines that it's reasonable and appropriate to not provide information to the Parliament, then that minister must provide a notice to both houses of the Parliament and to me, and I must form an opinion as to my view on the reasonableness and appropriateness of that decision. And that is an interesting source of tension that takes us as an office, rather than focusing on the operations of entities and reporting to Parliament, but directly into the decisions of a minister's office. And that's something that is uniquely Western Australian. It came out of the Commission on Government and was enshrined in my Act and the Financial Management Act in 2006 when those acts were reviewed.
It is as you'd probably imagine, if you've ever dealt with information requests from my office, the quality of the assurance that we can provide is directly influenced by the extent to which we can access information necessary for the performance of our functions. And I have very broad information gathering powers under Section 35 of my Act and other provisions that reinforce that I have access to any information I need to do my job in the way I determine it needs to be done, and I can't be directed by anyone having regard to Australian auditing standards, of course. But while my Act provides us with very broad powers to obtain information, there are occasions when we encounter difficulties getting full access due to the claims of commercial confidentiality, cabinet confidentiality, and legal or other privilege. These are often legitimate claims, and I respect those claims, and certainly the challenges and the judgment that Dr. Gallop outlined around balancing the public interest, and those claims are very real and alive in our Section 82 functions particularly. The legitimacy of those claims, I don't think, are always there, and we often dispute that. And our view as to the merit of those claims does not always align with the views of the department or the minister refusing to provide us with access. So part of our ongoing challenge is working with these parties to determine the circumstances under which disclosure is in the public interest, and our default position, which outweighs their concerns around the need to maintain confidentiality. So striking that balance is not always simple. But it really is critical in helping us to bring accountability to good government. And I do like Geoff's point that to articulate, and we often communicate this with departments and ministers' offices, is that interpretation of law requires judgment. And as Auditor General, I'm asked to provide my opinion on these matters, and it may differ. But if I outline the reasons for my opinion, it is just that, it's my opinion, and I do it as transparently and consistently as possible. And in accordance with law as I interpret it, and am accountable for that interpretation. And so something also Dr. Gallop touched on was around the, when civilisation is at stake, a good public service is so important. And I think that probably all of us in the room have noticed a concerning erosion of public trust in institutions, a cynicism that creeps into the public discourse, and that nihilistic view, I always question is where does it lead? What comes next? If we dismantle completely what we have, what comes next? And I feel that my role as Auditor General, I walk this fine line between holding government to account and not recklessly eroding trust in public institutions, because I could do it very easily. And it's really important that we both celebrate what is good about the public service. As auditors, we tend to go to the areas of highest risk and concern, so that's not always our headline issue. But throwing the baby out with the bathwater, rather than building on the foundation supports there and continually focusing on the improvements that need to be made to what's already there, is an important part of what we do and how we calibrate our findings. So thank you, Commissioner.
Thank you very much, Auditor General Caroline, for those very interesting comments about your role and some of the work that you do, and some of the challenges that you have as well in your role. Well, we've heard from Geoff, of course, and I'm going to begin the discussion by touching on some of the themes that Professor Gallop spoke about in his presentation. Of course, he talked about the right to know and the right to be involved, and it's the right to know, of course, we're going to have a lot of talk about that today, but it's the right to be involved that I'd like to take you up on, if I can. You talked about electoral democracy, moves toward, and the monetary democracy, progress towards that. I have understood that you've been very interested in the concepts of participatory democracy, which of course suggests participation, and I wonder if you could perhaps just speak to us about the relevance of information to participatory democracy, and perhaps what you mean by participatory democracy.
Yeah. I'm the research chair of the New Democracy Foundation, and the New Democracy Foundation encourages alternative methods of decision making built around the ancient and also the Renaissance Italian concept of citizens' juries, citizens' assemblies, where you randomly select people and then give them all of the information that's pertinent to a particular question. It's like a jury in a criminal trial, and then they make a recommendation. Now, I suppose the two prongs of open government, one is the right to know, which we've talked about in the context of freedom of information legislation, but which is a much broader concept. But then there's the right to be involved. Now, the narrow interpretation of the right to be involved has been expanded by the High Court of Australia with its decisions on political communication, that in a representative democracy, the people have a right to political communication, political speech, because otherwise, you know, the electoral process won't have the, if you like, the petrol, you know, to make it work well, which is information to people. But we've reached a point, I think, in respect of these issues where there is a feeling that the public are still not there. You know, they're still not in the processes adequately as perhaps they could. A lot of consultation processes are, not to put too fine a point on it, probably not effective in convincing people that they've really had a say. But if you have a random selected citizens' assembly, incidentally, the Irish have been using these, re their constitution, very important contribution that they've made, that you will get a better trust. Let me just throw out one idea. In the state of Oregon in America, although apparently the system's fizzled a little bit in recent times, they had a system where for every item that went to a referendum, you know, in America you can have citizens-initiated referendum, and whenever an item went to a referendum, you were required, as we've seen in Australia with the constitutional referendum of 1999, 1988, where people were given information. This is the case for yes, this is the case for no. In Oregon, what they did, for each one of these, they convened a randomly selected jury, and they considered it, and they said, we think this. And so when the public got their information, they got yes, no, and what the citizen jury thought. And the idea was, these are ordinary people coming up with their conclusion, and other ordinary people are interested in it, because the yeses and the nos, you sort of know who they're going to be. Anyway, now let's put this into the context of your work. It would be very interesting in terms of the legislation, where there are differences of opinion on this exemption issue. There are differences of opinion on how far you take the confidentiality concept in terms of cabinet. There are differences on business, whether or not it should be no disclosure or lots of disclosure. It would be very interesting to know what a randomly selected jury thought about these things. Now, you might say, well, that's just avoiding the argument. You know, you're just avoiding the point. You've got to make a decision and do it, and that's true. But I think in a lot of these issues, we're not solving these problems in our community. One side doesn't trust the other. Tax reform is just impossible. You've got some major issues of government, we're just not dealing with them because we know the voice to Parliament, the Aboriginal one, that's been vetoed before you even started, because the argument is, unless there's total agreement, you don't do it. Well, you'll stop everything through that. But if you had some mechanism to break that deadlock, and I don't think necessarily in FOI there's a huge deadlock, but in Canberra there is. Whistleblower, highly debatable whether whistleblowers in Canberra are actually going to be supported. Secondly, there's no corruption commission. Thirdly, FOI is coming back a bit in Canberra. I mean, it's getting improved, but they had a terrible period where, you know, the Freedom of Information Commissioner did his work from home because he had no budget. I mean, you know, what a ridiculous situation. And it might be interesting to know what a genuine public, ordinary people, randomly selected to consider, thought about the limits that should go with disclosure, the degree to which you need to tackle corruption, and all those questions. So the right to be involved is the other half of the equation, and I think we should go further. Interestingly, in Belgium, Eupen, the German-speaking part of Belgium, they are replacing their upper house with a randomly selected group of people who will consider their legislation. It's the first time a whole jurisdiction is doing it. There's a man called David Van Raybroek, who's a Dutch historian who's advocated for many years for this, and now they're doing it. So it'll be fascinating to look at how that works.
Thanks, Geoff. That's really fabulous to hear your views about that, and I couldn't agree more that it's the degree, it's the information that you give people before they make a...
You see, the other thing about juries is the people are in a position to say, this is the information I need to make this decision. You know, if you stick a microphone in someone, what do you think about X? Well, you know, that's not a deliberation. But if you put people into a situation where they ask for the information that they think is important, and you're talking about democracy. That's what it is. That's what democracy is. Proper deliberation by the people.
I've just been reminded to say to you, and I'm glad my children are not in this room because I have to pick up my phone. I'm always telling them to put theirs down. So I need my phone because I need to encourage you to ask some questions of the panel on Slido.
No more. There's enough.
There is enough. Okay, we have some questions. I'll just let Alison advise you about that.
Just to let you know, there are a lot of questions that you ask that will be more likely addressed this afternoon, and I'm happily archiving those to be thought about. So as you think about, so if your question disappears, don't worry, we haven't forgotten about it. But I'm trying to get you less to look at.
All right, thank you very much. Thanks, Alison. All right, so armed with my technology, I'm going to then go to Joanne on our panel, if I can, because I think there's an interesting question here about, just lost it, about FOI and privacy in Victoria and how those are managed. The question is, ahead of the introduction of WA privacy legislation, how is privacy in Victoria factored into FOI requests? In practice, how difficult is it to monitor privacy breaches? Now, I do appreciate the information, your role is in access to information, but hopefully you can tackle that question.
Yep, it certainly can. There's sort of a couple of there's two different questions there. So we've got a FOI Act and then a Privacy and Data Protection Act. So I'll chip off the FOI question first in considerations of privacy. So like WA, we have a provision where we have to determine whether something's got personal affairs information, and then now our test is whether it would be unreasonable to disclose that information. And as I mentioned earlier, most people in Victoria are normal citizens seeking access to their own information. Our top 10 agencies last financial year, of the 10, 5 were public hospitals, 1 was Ambulance Victoria, and 1 was our Department of Health and Human Services. So very health related and very personal affairs related. So interestingly, that's why I think that it's an area for us to look at, that so many people are requesting using FOI, which is sort of a bit of a not the best mechanism always to get access to your own information, to seek that information. So what we have to do is work out whether release is unreasonable in the particular circumstances. So we look at whether the information's sensitive, whether it's available publicly, how it was obtained, the purpose for which it was obtained. There's also consultation provisions that have been incorporated into our legislation where agencies, unless it's not practicable to do so, must consult a third party. Now, I think it's fair to say that drives our FOI practitioners crazy, our agencies, because one, they're not sure really what practicable means. Again, they want real, certainty. Decision makers like certainty, but in government, and I think as Geoff, clearly pointed out, that sort of judgment is required all the time. I think that's a really interesting part of the work that we do, balancing competing interests. And with personal affairs information, that's like the public interest, that's definitely a key area. In relation to privacy, one issue that I think will really interest this audience, and I'd be interested to kind of get a gauge of hands that might come through Slido or the like, or real ones, is it's a real debate, and it's also going on in the Commonwealth as well. The release of agency officers' names in requests. It's such a sort of a nubby issue. The Information Commissioner and I take the view that as public servants, if you're undertaking your usual work duties, your professional roles, and there's no special circumstances that relate to you or your role or the information that's being conveyed in a document, that information should go out. But that view is not sort of shared necessarily across the public sector. So we're having a healthy dialogue about that and trying to sort of work out that kind of line between privacy and access to information. So privacy is a really live topic. And so then my colleague, a couple of doors down, Rachel, the Deputy Commissioner, obviously her functions are to protect privacy under the Victorian legislation. So it's interesting, I'm trying to release information, but then in that context. So it's an interesting one, and and maybe during the conversation, if anyone wants to come up, it's a really interesting issue. The Commonwealth, the Office of the Information Commissioner up in the Commonwealth, Angeline Falk, they released a discussion paper, and that's available online on their website, and also submissions. And we made a submission, and I understand other jurisdictions did as well. So now, in relation to privacy breaches, the Commonwealth obviously has a mandatory breach notification scheme. We don't have one in Victoria, but we do encourage agencies to reach out to us and tell us where they've had a breach. And they do occur from time to time, probably more often than we obviously know about, because it's a non-mandatory scheme. But we're really involved in trying to get in there early and assist agencies in making their way through that sort of process to address risk and assist them with that. Part of our information security, though, also links with the privacy function, and that is doing that proactive work of making sure that our agencies in Victoria, and I think we're the only state with this power, to make sure that they abide by standards, the Victorian data protection standards, and there's a framework and then there's standards, and we've just released our second version of the standards, all available online. And we really work with agencies to make sure that they understand what information they have. When you start talking about privacy and even FOI and data security, you really need to look at information as an asset and value it as an asset. You know, like you would a building, or you look after roads, or you look after a community landscape. Information is so important, and it's becoming increasingly important. If you don't have good information record keeping and management, as Caroline told us, it makes her job certainly difficult. But what about you guys? How do you go about finding records or documents? How do you know if you've found everything? Don't answer that. That's a really live issue. So good FOI, good privacy, good info security, I think starts with looking at your information management and protecting that information and knowing where it is and what value, and then also what can be released and what can't. So there's a couple of different questions there. I hope that I've answered that.
That's fine. Thank you very much, Joanne. And look, I might just say that question, of course, talked about ahead of the introduction of privacy legislation, which, of course, is in the hands of the government. But certainly the experience that my office has in handling requests for documents that contain personal information gives us some insight into the importance of privacy. And, of course, we made an extensive submission in response to the government's discussion paper, and which, again, is available or will soon be available publicly. But it's a fascinating development, and we certainly take the view that privacy and access to information are complementary, and in fact are not opposed to one another. That with adequate safeguards around privacy, people will be confident that release of documents that contain personal information will be properly protected. So,
Catherine, if I can just add as well, thinking about information and information rights as a human right, whether you're thinking about that and having those thoughts and reading about information as a human right, and it is a human right. We've got a human rights charter in Victoria, but you don't need one don't need a Human Rights Act to have that as an information right, but privacy as well. So they're really important. They are important for democracy. They are important for public participation, government decision making, and improving government decision making. But just as a fundamental human right. And whilst you're all FOI practitioners, you're also citizens as well. And I think it's often good to have that empathy, to put yourself in the shoes of the person requesting that information from that big government department, and really getting in there and assisting them where you can to get access to information.
Thanks, Joanne. So effectively, human rights practitioners, everybody in this room. And I say that very seriously. Ian, I'm going to go to you now. Ian, you've talked about sort of a pro-disclosure outlook that you have in respect of local government. But what do you do if the release of the information could be damaging to local government, or the timeliness of the release is an issue in that it concerns some of what Professor Gallop talked about, the sort of the thinking space, the deliberations of government. How do you deal with the release of information in that context?
Look, for me, it's always about being on the front foot, not letting information dictate to you, but understanding what the information, as it's released, will mean to the receiver, and then being able to respond as an organisation. So what I do in many circumstances is I'll call relevant people together in my organisation. Generally, if the information's got a degree of interest from the media, there'll be my communications marketing manager, coordinator, who are experts in dealing with the media, the relevant officers. And we'll try and establish a game plan which gives us, you know, the statements that we want to make, so that we're not caught on the back foot. We are able to deal positively with whatever's gone before us. And I think one of the important things when you're dealing with issues in the public arena, and Dr. Gallop's probably in a better position to comment than me, but things can change so very quickly that you need to be very, very flexible around your plans. So the worst thing is to have a plan, but then sort of stick to it without changing. Not quite in the area of information release, but for those of you that have been in WA a long time, you might remember that we had a man in Gosnells who decided to live in a tree for over 100 days. That occurred soon after I arrived in Gosnells. And we used a sort of similar approach with that man, because you know, we would daily get suggestions about why don't we put bull ants under the tree, or why don't we bring a swarm of bees there. And so we had to have daily responses to some of these more interesting suggestions as to how we might deal with it, and just to reflect on the importance of being flexible in terms of revisiting plans and making sure you're putting forward your rationale in a good light.
Very good. Thank you so much. It's a very useful, I think, and practical answer. Caroline, to you. You talked about the challenges about accessing information to carry out audit. Do you have a view about the impact technology has in terms of the creation, the volume of documentation that's now available in government, and the accessibility or discoverability of that, both for your processes but also perhaps in terms of release of the information to the public?
From the perspective of audit, it's obviously challenging. It can make information requests more timely because you don't have officers having to go off to archives off-site and trawl through not just boxes but containers and you know what it looks like. It can be in systems, but you know there's no uniformity in systems or how data is created and stored across the sector or even within entities. You know, obviously from an audit perspective, data analytics is an emerging field. I think sometimes I've maintained some scepticism, if you like, over whether it's the panacea in audit, because it allows you to suck in a whole lot of data, but the rabbit holes you can go down to in terms of interpreting data and what it means, you still require human judgment, human eyes on things. But it's an interesting point, I guess this is possibly of less interest to those in the room than the sort of more human policy matters, but from a financial information perspective, our office did an audit a data analytics audit of $7.5 billion worth of expenditure, payroll and goods and services over 12 entities. And you'd expect the payroll data is pretty uniform and more so than goods and services data around, and the current issue of incurring and certifying of invoices, and how you can suck that data on a large scale for large entities with thousands and thousands of invoices a week across the sector. How you can then analyse that around appropriateness of authorisation and processing. We found that just for 12 entities for a certain time period, that was actually quite a complex task, and the insights that it can give you are less than when there is uniformity of that. So, like everything, I think we just all need to read the history books to understand this is an ongoing challenge for the public service, it's an ongoing challenge for auditors, it's an ongoing challenge. How do you get people to participate in democracy? As another, who was it, President in West Wing? God, I can't even believe I've forgotten this. President Bartlett, as he said, decisions are made by those who turn up, and there's variations of that throughout other quotable quotes. But getting people, these are common challenges, Kath, and as you know, the method of creation and storage and accessibility influences the timeliness of decision making, the ability to present that in a transparent way, and therefore promote accountability. It will be ongoing. There will be no panacea when we get information, better, improved information sharing laws or things, because there's humans involved.
Indeed. All humans doing our best. I would like again to go to Geoff to just talk about this idea of culture, and we've got 1 minute to go. The issue of culture. OVIC, and before I do, OVIC has done a study in conjunction with the Monash University just recently, looking at the administration of FOI and the culture around the administration of FOI and government agencies. It's a pilot study and some very interesting results around that, talking about how, or a finding rather, that within agencies, it's the leadership in the agencies that is more crucial and sometimes more obstructive to a release of information than even ministerial level. And it's an interesting finding with some recommendations there, and hopefully a study, Joanne, that might be broadened to encompass other jurisdictions. So hopefully I've got the sort of nub of that study correct. I'd like to throw it over to Dr. Gallop to just make some comments for us. I know we've got very little time left, about culture, and then perhaps I'll ask the rest of the panel to talk about culture. Ian's touched on it already, but the culture of information release within government.
Well, there's no doubt that there are some big issues of government and the way that it operates that really need a push from the top. The best analogy I can give was that, I was very interested in the idea of a sustainability approach to government, that you look at the social, economic and environmental factors in relation to any policy. And you might remember there was a major report came out outlining the strategy, and one part of it was to get within government a clear understanding of what they meant, and then to drive it through the system. And getting all agencies in government sort of, keep geared up to thinking differently about what they were doing. And, progress was being made. But I think this is the analogy. Obviously, the culture of openness, it's not universally accepted, but we do understand at the same time that obviously there is going to be exemptions, for public interest reasons. So I think you need the push from the top going right through the system. It will reflect in the legislation that you have. It'll reflect in the attitudes of your chief executives. One thing that I used to appreciate was the meeting I had with all of the heads of department. I had a strategic council, partly designed to find out what the ministers were up to, but don't tell them that. But they were a really good opportunity to say, this is what the government's on about, sustainability, and I want you all to take that message out. So if there was that equivalent, I'd say, this is what openness is all about. And one of the recommendations of the New South Wales Freedom of Information Inquiry of 2009 was that the Premier issue a memorandum to all agencies that, this is the system and this is the legislation we're going to have, and it requires you to think this way rather than that way.
Thank you. Thoughts, some definite...
So there's an idea from
definite
Premier.
food for thought. Thank you very much.
I might ring up Mark McGowan later on and see how we go.
can I say please do? Caroline, any thoughts just around a brief comment, probably a concluding comment about culture of openness?
Look, it all comes down to people and tone from the top. Integrity, but openness more broadly, and the commitment to serving the community that we're a part of, but we're appointed and entrusted to look after. And just a comment perhaps in response to Ian's comment around risk. I'm not risk averse at all. I think we need to actively engage in risk, and that obviously comes with its challenges. But what's the opposite of risk? It's doing nothing. And that will achieve nothing for the communities that we're here to serve. And so it's that culture of actually engagement, proactive engagement with these issues, because they're not simple, but we need to find a path forward and justify that, be accountable for that.
Thank you very much, Ian. If you could make some comments.
I sort of made my comments before, but for me, it's really around trying to ensure that we, as the City of Gosnells, my people, but the public sector, we're really working to take opportunities to take the public forward, to help improve our communities. Because I ask myself, why do I go to work? And I go to work because I want to make the lives of people better. And I want to go home and I want to finish my career knowing I've significantly enhanced the lives of those communities. And as public servants, I think that should be the driving motivation for us all. We're here for it, not, the greater good. And so I think it's really looking for those opportunities and trying to build that culture of accepting the opportunities. And the opportunities are with the community, and we engage with them.
Thank you. I love what you're saying about opportunity, seeing risk as opportunity. It's wonderful. Joanne, if you can finish for us. Thank you.
Culture is a really important aspect of information access. You can have very strong laws, but if the culture's not there, it's very difficult to have those laws really come into effect. The study, the research told us that culture is really supported, where it's supported from the executive level, and I think, Ian, you're a very fine example of that. You're going to have a good culture of public disclosure within your agency. But I also think it comes from the ground up as well, although I think proactive disclosure is a difficult thing. Sometimes it's not always considered, and we saw this in our research that we obtained. Some officers didn't think that their role was about proactive disclosure. They thought it was just about FOI. I respectfully disagree. But I call to you, the people in this audience, to sort of see, think about what you hear today and what we've discussed today, and think about your role in the agency and your role in the public sector as well. And if it's not a conversation that you're having in your agencies, think about who you could co-opt to, and it may be a situation of safety in numbers, but see who you could speak to. Who's the executive, the head of corporate services, the CEO? Hopefully you're working in agencies where there is a good, strong, positive culture of discussion and a little bit of healthy debate as well. But take some of these ideas back, because as FOI practitioners, you guys have to be so skillful. Attention to detail, knowing your agency, knowing where documents are, balancing these competing interests. A lot of that good culture really lies with you, and you could really take a leadership role in promoting positive culture in your organisations.
Thank you. That's a fabulous note to end on, and I'd like to all to invite everybody here to thank our audience, thank our panel.